Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Future Space. I'm your host, Daniel Fox. Our guest today is George Dyson. George is a historian of technology who lived in a treehouse 30 meters above the ground for 3 years. He holds employee number 3 at Blue Origin, was 5 years old at the founding of Project Orion in 1958, and hoped to go along. He's the author of several books and has written about the first 10,000 years of the Aleutian kayak, the natural history of artificial intelligence, the path not taken into space, the origins of the digital universe, and why analog computing is destined to regain control. Mr. Dyson, welcome to The Future Space.
Thank you for bringing me here.
George, what would be your 3 words that for you capture the essence of space?
Okay, so first off, I'm a historian, so I don't usually delve into the future. And as a historian, my 3 words would be this new ocean. And that was the title of the first NASA official history, which is just a fantastic document, a book that captured at the time the real story of Project Mercury, how we as Americans got into space to begin with. And that title came from the famous speech that John F. Kennedy gave in 1962, where he said we were going to the moon. And he said, only if the United States occupies a position of preeminence can we help decide whether this new ocean will be a sea of peace or a terrifying new theater of war. And that's kind of exactly where we are today. And it sort of sums it up. And there's a backstory there that, maybe we'll get into. But this speech is famous for Kennedy having launched Apollo mission. But what was not really known was at the time that he was simultaneously canceling Project Orion. So he made a choice between the sort of 4,000-ton vehicle it would take 50 to 100 people to Saturn for the little ship that would take 4 people to the moon. And that, to me, was sort of anyway, this new ocean is still where we are. This sort of new ocean is in front of us.
Are you talking about this new ocean, the metaphor to a lot of the relationships, but also as a reference to technology and the challenges that back in those days, ocean exploration was very dangerous. Now we look back and we take it for granted, but they were navigating blind with technologies that were extremely rudimentary. And now we're at the place with space, and where I'm pretty sure that 50, 60 years from now, we'll look back and we'll think this time is very simple. But right now, those challenges are meaningful to us.
Yes, of course, still quite dangerous on the ocean. You can come to harm, but you obviously, of course, speaking over Starlink right now, and you can call for help. So different world, which will never be true in space. It's still going to be very hard to get immediate help.
Do you think even in 125 years, space will still remain a very harsh or difficult world for us to navigate?
For people, but again, that's sort of your next question.
Yes. What would be for you the human story of space?
I'm going to be difficult on that question, and speaking only for myself, not for anybody I work for, so on. I'm a skeptic. I don't think people really have much of a near future in space. It's just not a welcoming environment for people. But on the other hand, I'm very optimistic that space is a very good place for sort of beyond humans. I mean, whatever the next step is. The thing to remember about nature is that nature works through speciation. If an animal lands on a new island, in Tasmania or something, it becomes something different. So when you get to Tasmania, you find a whole different population of animals that have speciated. And I think that's the promise of space, that it's sort of going to allow life to speciate into different forms, and to expect them to be humans eating breakfast cereal and speaking English is just grossly, I think that was wrong. What was wrong with a lot of science fiction, and what's right about some of the good science fiction, get beyond that.
Now, you have a background that's very interesting. Your father, your sister has been associated with space and science, but also you lived in a treehouse for 3 years. You've spent a lot of time in the wilderness. I think that's something that both you and I, we do share. We've had one foot in both worlds. And you're number 3 employee at Blue Origin. Explain to me a little bit how this complicated puzzle has come together.
Just a series of accidents. I never had any plan. I mean, when I grew up as a child, the only person I think who has any association with Blue today who actually saw Sputnik. I mean, my dad dragged me outside at 2 a.m. to watch Sputnik go by. So I just have a very token position, sort of historian in residence who's a relic of that past. But my father, Freeman, was fully intending to go. He and his kind of best friend, Ted Taylor, were dead serious about building this 4,000-ton surface-of-Earth takeoff mass real spaceship. I mean, built like an ocean liner. And the plan was to make a 5-year voyage, not even stopping at the moon. They had no interest. They would stop at Mars, leave some people on Mars, and then go to one of the satellites of Saturn and back. So as a child, I thought that was going to happen. So everything from then on was just a disappointment. Anyway, so when Neil Stephenson was sort of the co-founder of Blue Origin, he brought me in. I actually still work under a contract that was written by him. And I think any writer would give their right arm to an employment contract written by Neil Stephenson, who never wastes a word. He just put down in writing what he thought I could do. And it's been a miracle. I've been able to, all my other work in history is sort of studying old dead projects that happened 50 or 100 or 300 years ago, and to sort of watch something in real time with a group of living, thriving people is very, very refreshing. And sort of, in a way, I think saved me from either being that guy who lived in a treehouse for the rest of my life. I didn't want to do that. Brought me into a very, very vibrant world.
So what brings you to have a different opinion about our place in space? Is it because it hasn't materialized itself, or you see some major flaw into that thinking? What's the rationale behind?
Enormous part of my life was spent studying the sort of prehistory of North America. And that's where my work in the Aleutian Islands were continuously settled by the same group of people on the same islands for 10,000 years. There's almost nowhere on Earth where we have that continuous and unchanged civilization without other people coming in and destroying it. And then, of course, the Russians showed up one day in 1741, and we have good records of that. So it fascinated me how that happened. And what I found, which is obvious, but the mythology is that brave single humans, of course mostly male, came to the new world and built a new life, and that's what we are going to now do in space. But the truth is really quite different. That every account that I read, and it was clear that the people who came to North America survived through the generosity or through the resources, either by cooperation or force, of the indigenous people who were here already. And of course, then you say, well, the indigenous people came here in the first place, and they were real pioneers. But even so, North America was full of megafauna, and they lived on the megafauna. So we were always exploring thanks to the resources of other creatures, and we don't have that in space. Space is empty of indigenous inhabitants that we know about, and so I think it has to be a different model. We have that model now in front of us. Sort of robotics is just improving so far rapidly than biological evolution, and by establishing a thriving population of robots, humans will come later. And I'm also actually not allowed to talk about anything. I can talk about the past. This is the contract that Neil wrote for me. I can talk about the past, and I can talk about the far future, but I can't talk about what's in the middle. So in the far future, I think it's safe to say in the far future, we will have this sort of indigenous population out in space that can help support the brave people who show up.
It's very interesting, even being in Canada. And also, I love history and learning about the tragedies of the past and how what we take for granted usually has a long process of hard work and luck and various elements coming together by some miracle. But on the arrival of the European to North America, I spent quite some time on the Pacific Northwest with several First Nations. We often talk about that period as if it was one giant block where everybody was walking hand in hand, and it was a very complicated world. Even just on Haida, the archipelago between the north of Haida and the south of Haida, and how the Haida would push the Tlingit or some other tribes. It was very complicated, let's put it this way. So what brought you to the Aleutians, and most particularly your interest into the kayak? The kayak is a very specific mode of transportation, which I used for all my expeditions because I'm a water person. You can carry a lot of gear with you. There's an intimate relationship with water. But I'm kind of curious to hear from your perspective, what was your attraction to the kayak and to Aleutian?
I mean, the kayak is the answer to an optimization problem. So how do you get the maximally seaworthy amount of boat out of the absolute minimum of material, almost no material? And So these things, again, happened by accident. When I was 12 years old, for some reason, I decided to build a kayak. And I built it, out of sticks of wood. Again, because I wanted a boat, and it was sort of the way to get a boat out of nothing. And it worked very well, but there was nowhere to go in New Jersey. And then I had a very bad relationship with the formal education system. So I skipped high school. I would disappear and go hide you could get into the university library, which was closed, but if you went when all the students were going in at first class, you could just sort of get swept in by the tide. And I would go down in the basement. Firestone Library had 8 miles of stacks, and there was a room where some alumni who must have given some money, where they had kept his library intact and an armchair. And he had a whole library of like Arctic exploration and stuff. So I read all these journals of these trips to the Arctic and just dreamed of that. Then 4 years later, ended up in Vancouver, Canada at my sister's wedding. Saw a classified ad for a job on a boat. There was no Craigslist or anything. Of course, when I saw the environment around British Columbia, then I'd say, okay, this is where I really need a kayak. Started seriously building more.
There's a famous kayak museum in Greenland. I can't remember exactly at which village, but it was very interesting to see how there was so many variations of kayaks depending on which people up north, different models of kayaks.
I've never been to Greenland, and that field has been I've been marvelously eclipsed by a gentleman named Harvey Golden, who has done 3 huge volumes of kayaks of Alaska, kayaks of Greenland, and kayaks of the Arctic. Each is like 600 pages, and he's devoted his whole life to that. And all I've done is supply him the skin material, because he not only studies the boat, but then he builds one to be able to see how it behaves. And yeah, it's it's a perfect example of how things speciate. And with kayaks, the thing that I think sometimes isn't understood enough is that I think a lot of those features were in the military aviation, you call it identification, friend or foe. That if you're having a war in the air or something, it's beneficial to both sides to be able to differentiate their own planes from the enemy planes. You kind of don't want to be shot down you'd rather be shot down by the enemy than by your friends. And so you display. That's why people don't cheat, sort of fight in unmarked airplanes. And I think kayaks were the same way, because as you just said, there was a lot of warfare going on between local groups. So to have your kayaks look different from the people you might be at odds with was beneficial.
You mean like traveling around the world for Americans to put the Canadian flag on their luggage?
Yes, that's very unfair.
It was really interesting when I was paddling on Kodiak Island. Some of the nations over there, they were doing whaling back in those days in kayak, but it was the shaman who would be doing the hunting, and they would have a poison dart, and then they would know because of the currents where the whale will end up. And then it was a big ceremony, but it was contrary to some other tribes where it was more of a communal activity. This was more the responsibility of the shaman, and he would go away and prepare the whole potion, the poison.
They had a system of barcoding, really like a digital barcode for barcoding the harpoon heads, so that when the whale was recovered, you could identify who had thrown the harpoon that was closest to the heart, counted, and could claim the whale, which was also very clever.
Studying the Aleutian, was there a big difference between each of the islands, between the far west and the far east? Or the Aleutians can be seen as kind of one group of people?
Well, there were very strong local differences, but then there was a sort of cohesive culture across the whole chain. And then Kodiak was really quite different. And the islands, of course, the islands that are far from us are still called the near islands because they were named by the Russians, and to the Russians they were the near. And it's just a fascinating history. I mean, the history of the Aleutians is, if there was sort of an intelligent design trying to, optimize kayaks and design some planet to do that, the Aleutians were like the perfect laboratory, where the islands were far enough apart you had to really have high performance kayaks to get from island to island, 60-mile crossings in bad seas. Yet they were just close enough together that you could have a sort of crossbreeding population across the whole chain.
It's quite fascinating. I mean, for me, looking into the future and looking into the past, I can only be hopeful that we'll figure things out, because the kind of stuff that we've put together and we invented, even with instruments that were just so rudimentary and not lacked because now we look back, but they were able to achieve so much just by constantly seeking those solutions. And so now as we go to space, yes, there's a lot of issues, there's a lot of problems, but also is there capacity to gather the information. This is one of the things that for me is very different nowadays. the human cost of knowledge, the human cost of exploration will never be what it used to be. If we read these stories of figuring out the weather in Antarctica during the winter, someone had to build a cabin, had to survive for the entire winter, almost die in the process. If you wanted to know if Greenland was an island or not island, you had to physically go and walk around either during the winter or the summer. Now we have helicopters and rovers on Mars gathering the information, and there's a way for us to assess the environment and the unknown so that by the time we go to these places, we're not blind. So the world, the era of exploration is going to be very different.
Well, first of all, the Aleutians are a great example of, my father had a bet that I don't think was ever, of course it was never settled, he didn't live, but I mean his bet was that the first extraterrestrial life will not be discovered on a planet, that the planets are much less interesting than all the objects, the millions of objects that are floating around, comets and things like that. He personally believed we'd probably first find evidence of life on a comet because they travel so much. And so you have the continents that have these very big stable populations, and then you have an archipelago like the Aleutians or like Haida Gwaii, and those, or the Galapagos or something, you get these very interesting things happen among clusters of islands. And I think that's the great dream of space colonization when it happens, is that once you start colonizing the Kuiper Belt or something like that, you then really have something interesting where it's not just the American colony on Mars, or say whole distributed system. And also you mentioned knowledge, and that's also the thing we got from the indigenous inhabitants, that we would land completely unknown, and then somebody would say, yeah, okay, there's you're dying of thirst, there's water over there. And that's again where the technology can give us what we need, which is to know. So the fundamental thing about space is there's two resources that, for life as we know it, to survive in space. We need water and we need sunlight. Those are the two important things. And the sunlight is very evenly distributed. At any point in space, you can predict exactly what the sunlight will be, and you can capture it. Really speaking just of the solar system. But the water is very unevenly distributed. There's certain places that have water. Comets have water. South pole of the moon has water. Certainly water on Mars. That's more like the desert, where there's just certain watering holes, and life will tend to grow around those places.
My personal opinion is our expansion beyond Earth will follow water. We'll find out that there's a lot of water in many places, but it will stretch in the same way that it stretched on Earth, and where we followed water. We established these places, first of all, that were more convenient for trade, and then after that, it diversified. But it will be resource-driven, obviously. And then the other opinion I have is, I think we will discover that life abounds in the universe, but the conditions to sustain life are very rare. Much like when you go to a lava field, the land is twisted, desolate, and then you have these little mini shoots that are just growing in the weird places. So the air or the ocean is always full of life. A spoon of seawater is filled with organisms, but that doesn't mean that it will sustain or they will continue to create life. And I think that the universe is the same. Whether it's comets or Mars, we will find life everywhere. It's just that the conditions to sustain it are very, very rare.
Well, first of all, so much has changed since like 1960, when we sort of thought the solar system as being much more dry and desert, and now we really know where there is all this water that we didn't know about. And the same with life. We thought the inside of the Earth was completely sterile and empty. Now we're finding there's life very deep and within ourselves. So, we sort of had this illusion of, we're just going to send man into space. But each of us, we have something like on the order of 10,000 species of microorganisms that have to go with us and sort of have to be kept. We're just part of this living system. To sort of make that work in space, it has to be much more than just people if they're going to stay healthy.
For me, that's one of the responsibility now that we have as a species, is the vastness and scale of the universe with the ingredients of life, because it's random, because it's not engineered. At some point, somewhere, the conditions are going to be right, the luck for something amazing to happen. But the driving force of life is to connect. And so if you have this evolution for billions of years from single cell to multi-cell, connecting and evolving, growing in complexity, it would be such a shame to be limited on this tiny speck in the grand universe. So now there's one species that we know of that has the capacity to continue that story, to take life and continue beyond the planet. The universe is waiting for that disruption, is waiting for life to continue. And not only we can do it, but there's a responsibility that comes with it.
Yes, and there's personally, again, it's just my own tendency, but I lean towards panspermia, which is main proponent was Fred Hoyle, who was a good astronomer, but really believed that life was distributed across the universe and move around as remnants of DNA carried by comets and things like that, and had pretty crazy theories, but they're not impossible, of how that may have seeded life on Earth in the beginning. And I think we may be on the verge of finding that true on Mars, that we'll find some sign of life on Mars that has evidence of microbial life that has some connection to our own, because stuff is always bouncing back and forth between Earth and Mars on a geological timescale.
You wrote about the natural history of artificial intelligence. We love to call AI artificial intelligence. For a long time, there's been debates on exactly what it is. The power of computing is not necessarily intelligence. Are you still looking at it as the boundaries between computing power and what it's becoming? It's getting harder and harder to make a difference between artificial intelligence? Or are you in the camp of the human intelligence is very something different than any computer intelligence we'll get to?
You're getting ahead of that. Was going to be one of my last words. But the short answer is both. I mean, I think, artificial intelligence is real, but a lot of what we're being sold as AI really isn't. I mean, it's become a label, like contains magic dust, and now it's AI. But people have been thinking about AI for a long time. 3 of my books are effectively about AI, and one about the prehistory of AI. So as with space, you can learn so much by going back. Before the space age, people were thinking very creatively about space, and sort of before the current mania about AI, people were in some ways thinking more clearly about it because they weren't obscured. And my personal short sort of answer is that I'm not at all afraid of bad AI. Like, it doesn't scare me at all, the classic science fiction bad AI that tries to take over the world, but I'm terrified of good AI, and that's what scares me now. The sort of the good AI. Let me just do this, make your life a little more comfortable, and let me into your house, and that scares me. But shouldn't probably say any more about that. But the bad AI does not scare me.
So the good AI scares you in the
it terrifies me
in the way that it will be harder to not defend ourselves, but to think that there are complications or issues with it. Like a chameleon that just naturally blends itself into the community, and next thing you know, you've totally forgotten. Okay.
Yes. Just makes us too comfortable. Like, you go off to the movies, I'll take care of your children, just leave me in. That won't end well.
I'm always quick to remind myself is the world of computer is usually extremely structured and controlled. But in nature, and this is where the human intelligence, really differs, independently of how much you want to replicate or you want to control it, there's always an element of chaos. There's always, and nature doesn't want perfection. Nature wants evolution. It wants to make sure that it adapts so that it grows. So there's always going to be the unpredictable, the chaotic. And that is independently of how much you can have tools that will take away a certain task. The human mind will use that, step outside the beaten path, and create something else.
I mean, that's why, if we can speak in trade names, ChatGPT hit such a nerve. Why it suddenly, 4 years ago, just everybody went nuts, because in the old school, effectively, my mother was father gets all the credit, but my mother was a mathematical logician who worked in really the foundations of computing and really schooled me in the logical, don't make mistakes. But the definition of a digital computer, I mean, really the strict Alan Turing definition, is that it's a machine that if you ask the same question, you will always get the same answer. If it doesn't, then something's wrong. And then with ChatGPT, we suddenly, everybody expected that from your computers. It might crash, but it basically always gave precise answers. But with ChatGPT, you gave people a machine where they could ask a question, and 5 minutes later they could ask exact same question and get a different answer. And that really, we have a sense for that. The way that, humans evolved with the ability to, we can see a pair of eyes, just captures because we're always looking for the eyes of the predator or something. So that's the sign of intelligence that makes us go, It's when your child first starts to speak and says, no, I don't believe you. And you suddenly realize, you've created a human being that's got a mind of its own. And so that provoked people. And we're obviously still going through the repercussions of that.
Is there one platform more than another that you like or that you prefer, whether it's Anthropic, Claude, Gemini, Microsoft, ChatGPT, OpenAI, or some others?
I'm an absolute route. I don't touch any of them. I have never asked one question, and if it appears somewhere, I turn it off. I mean, I just don't live in that world. I mean, I'm going extinct. I wrote my books with a fountain pen. I wrote Darwin Among the Machines here in this beer cooler without access to I had to walk up to the university and log into a terminal with a 2 megabyte quota. Even as faculty, you got 2 megabytes. That if you went over 2 megabytes, you got a letter telling you were over your quota. And so, yeah, I just somehow can't teach an old dog new tricks.
I find it incredible. Back in the days of AOL, when the speed on the internet was 256 kilobytes per second, and then we celebrated when it went double to 512 kilobytes per second.
If you had a gold modem, you could get...
It was interesting. I was just in New York City. We were talking about friends about how back in those days, there was a certain understanding of the complexity of technology because things were big, right? Even a big TV. When you had a TV, it was huge. You had the tubes. Somehow your mind was being tricked in thinking that there must be something magical happening because it's such a big object. Even the phone, the first brick, the computers were big. Now everything is becoming so small. You look at it, its mind is trying to wrap itself around the fact that it's so thin. And with it, we lose the understanding of how complex it is, and we take things for granted. Do you find that our relationship with technology has a huge gap between what it takes and what we think actually is needed to make all that life of conveniency happen?
It's the sort of stuff used to be weird, wild predictions that it's entirely possible to build something that works, but you don't understand. And that's really the world we live in now, that we have very well-functioning systems where no person really understands how it's all working. And I used to be seen as a crazy outlier for saying that might not be so bad. That's the world that as a human species, that's the world we grew up in. The cultures that I spent so much of my life immersed in and studying were cultures where nature was presumed to be more intelligent than we were, and there were creatures. And you find that, you spent time in Alaska, where if you're camping on the beach, you share the beach with brown bears who are they are way more powerful than you are, and you have to accept that, and you learn to live with it. And that's where we are going with our machines, that they are more powerful than we are, and we are going to be forced to accept that in a sort of spiritual way. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, as long as the wrong people don't get control of that. That's what I sort of said about good AI being more scary than bad AI. Bad AI that is completely autonomous doesn't scare me, but good AI that is controlled by the XYZ corporation that's going to make your life comfortable is probably more dangerous.
You said on the beach in Alaska with the bears. In my book tour or whenever I did presentations with Feel the Wild, there was a photo of my foot next to a giant print of a grizzly bear. And the story that I tell is actually I was always extremely grateful every time that I landed on the beach and I saw those tracks, because it was a reminder this place did not belong to me, that I was a visitor and that this was their place. And my respect was expected as a visitor going to these territories. But the sense of wilderness in lower 48 is just more of a concept, right? We have these parks, but we're not necessarily living with the wilderness. When you go to Alaska, this is the thing that for me I've always loved about Alaska, is that wilderness is a reality. You got the bears, you got the scale, you got everything, the weather. It's something that you have to deal with, so you're constantly reminded of how small you are. Wilderness is an exercise of humility. Share with me some of the teachings or some of the big lessons that your time in the wilderness has brought to you.
Well, they're pretty obvious. We build your own little kayak and go out in the ocean. There's this, I don't have the exact quote, but nothing builds human character like being in a small boat at sea. That never goes away. It's just awe-inspiring. And of course, those waves hit the beach. There's just a lot going on for animals or life in general. When I did go to Vancouver at 17, then my first job with that boat, we went up to bring Dr. Paul Spong, who was studying killer whales in the wild, orcas. And that also, to me, was a revelation. I mean, here were these, because I had, as a child, a number of people sort of saved my life in various ways. And one of them was Trudy Szilard, who was the widow of Leo Szilard, the physicist who really had the first idea for a nuclear weapon, and then spent the rest of his life trying to stop them. But he wrote a little science fiction book called The Voice of the Dolphins, which was the people were, and he used to give it away to politicians in Washington trying to get them to read it, because the story was that as humans we were going to destroy the earth with nuclear weapons, and then the dolphins spoke up. It turned out they were intelligent to, take control and get us to stop. Anyway, Trudy gave me that book when I was 11 years old, and she used to take me to lunch. But she also told me, because everyone else expected, oh, you're Freeman Dyson's son, what kind of physics are you going to do? And she said, you don't have to do science at all. Don't believe those people. You do what you want to do. And she gave me that book, and I loved that book for the dolphin part. And then when I got to Hansen Island, where Paul Spong was, it was real. He had hydrophones on 24 hours a day hearing the communications of these creatures, which I think are still completely misunderstood. For 50 years ago, scientists thought if they dropped hydrophones in the water, they would hear the language of the whales and they would decipher it. And they're still up there. There's still scientists who are trying to, we're going to decipher this language. A creature in that environment doesn't, with a huge brains are 3 times the size of ours, they don't need language. They might, language is a construct of us needing to communicate, probably starting with sign language over a very noisy channel. But whales, orcas particularly, I mean, they see the world through sound. They sort of visualize with sound, and they can exchange sounds. As if we could directly share visual imagery brain to brain. We wouldn't need a language that goes down to this very low level coding where we agree on a word for cat, and I say cat and you see cat. I just could project cat. So I think there might be a very, very different form of communication. And the view that we haven't found whale language, therefore I think it could be completely sort of non-sequential language. We have to put words in order to convey a thought that maybe they don't. Anyway, that to me was even just ravens. Any of the animals, if you spend time with them, you realize there's way, way, way more intelligence going on than, a lot of people believe.
Ravens are quite something. If you spend some time in Alaska, Pacific Northwest, in the remote places, there's definitely something quite grand with those giant birds, just the way that they vocalize or the way that they act. And it's been proven that they can pass information through generations, which is quite something. Something I would like to have your thoughts on about artificial intelligence. We have this habit to think that the conclusion by default of AI is one day we'll recognize that humans are an hindrance to everything, and therefore the logical conclusion is just to eradicate everything. My take is, because we can see even with us, when a species becomes more and more intelligent, it actually recognizes that diversity is a necessity for the good of everything. The richness, the diversity, the figuring out the win-win situation for several actors to participate is actually a sign of intelligence. If you look back in the days of wars and tribes, it was very black and white. I have to exist, you can't, and we have a war, this territory is mine, and so forth. And you get to a point where it's less about having this binary mode of looking at the world, but it's more understanding all the complexities and all the richness of it. My take is, if one day AI becomes super intelligent, it will come to a similar conclusion that a world where humans are present will be for the benefit of all the other, like even to artificial intelligence.
Yes, I would like to believe that. There's another scenario where people need to be kept around just to connect Ethernet cables and no longer need their intelligence. That's sort of the... But, time will tell. The interesting thing is it's happening so fast. It used to be, you'd say, well, I got to wait 200 years and find out. Now it's like maybe wait 10 years and find out. I strongly feel that the thing called the Turing test is totally wrong, that the sign of one of the signs of a true artificial intelligence would be it would not reveal its intelligence. It would play dumb. And that just the fact that, we don't have machines that pass, some people think now we do. So that's not a sign that it's not happening. And I just want to say, when you asked me to have this conversation, there's one fundamental thing about space that I think is to me is the most important, but it didn't really come up in the question. And that, another one of my heroes is a Swedish physicist, Hans Alfvén, who believed in magnetohydrodynamics and was ridiculed for it, but in the end won the Nobel Prize, and he was right. But he wrote a science fiction book under a pseudonym. But he believed in a hierarchical cosmology, which is different than the Big Bang. I mean, the interesting thing about the universe or about space is that if you believe in the hierarchical cosmology where things just, there's particles and there's atoms and there's solar systems and there's galaxies, and it has the ultimate property that the density approaches zero. As you measure the density, it drops and drops and drops, so the density effectively goes to zero. But the mass goes to infinity. So you have something that has zero density and infinite mass. And that, I think, is what, I think ultimately, if you're trying to design a universe, those are two seemingly contradictory boundary conditions that can both be true. And that's sort of, I think, what makes the universe interesting, that we somehow are in this world that, if you gave it any specific density, it would all sort of collapse. But this idea of a zero density and infinite mass is somehow, that's why space is out there. Otherwise, you wouldn't have space.
If you had the chance to go to space, would you go to space?
If I had the chance, if you offered me the chance, sure. My view on life is do anything once. So
one of the things that for me about space that I'm hoping we'll get to see soon is part of the problem on Earth is not the resources that we have, it's the extraction of resources. So the sooner that we can get resources from places that are less rich, more desolate, then it's going to be much better for the planet. In the same way that, now we have homes, where all the resources that we need to live, your food, your power, your water, everything now is outsourced somewhere else, and everything that you do goes somewhere else, so that your home can just be for your enjoyment. Ultimately, that's how I see Earth at some point. So, George, what would be your 3 words of wisdom?
I'll try and stick to 3 words. The first one is de-scope. And at Blue, we had we still do, but I don't know, there's now so many of them, I don't know them. But we had very wise people who came from different parts of the space ecosystem. And I cannot remember who it was, but one of our meetings, they said de-scope early and de-scope often. And I think that is real wisdom, that when you plan a voyage or a project, you want to do all these things. You want to bring back samples, you want 10 different things, and then in reality, you get down to the deadline and you have to de-scope. And the sooner you de-scope, the better. And I think that's true of all of our lives. And so that's wisdom. The second comes from my sort of painful career as a writer. I was late with everything. And that word is roughness. Some of my books were 8 years late. And roughness in the sense of, this comes from painting, from commercial painting. It says, leave a rough edge. Don't try and leave a clean edge. Like, don't try and get to the end of a chapter and stop. You'll never get going again. Just stop mid-sentence. Then it's easy to come back and finish that sentence and you're moving again. I think that goes with a lot of things in life, that you're better to leave a rough edge that you can come back to, and then people don't sort of see the seams. And the third one, we kind of got to already. My 3rd word is AI. And that I would just leave with the question. And the question is, what if artificial intelligence isn't? That allows you to choose the way you parse that question. So you can say, what if artificial intelligence isn't artificial? That's the optimistic view I think you have, that artificial intelligence is just the next step. Natural intelligence, it's not really artificial. Or you can be sort of more of the pessimist and say, well, what if artificial intelligence isn't intelligent? What if this stuff we're being sold as AI is not really AI? And that's the question is in front of us right now, that we have to choose our answers to that question, make sure we go the right way.
I cannot but be not naive, optimistic about the general outcome of it. I think if there is one thing that history teaches you, if you're very close to these events, it looks like it's the end of the world. When you step back, you realize how, like even in nature, in the forest, the collapse of one tree is not the end of the forest. It's actually the opening of light, and you have some who will benefit and others who will not. And is it good, is it bad? Well, it depends where you set in that equation. Our own society exists because others have collapsed, and the church banned the printing press because it was losing control of storytelling. And here we are, 2,000 years later, or not even 500 years later, and things are very different. these technologies, even more so today because we're so much in the thick of it, we're constantly being bombarded by the worst case scenario, that it's really hard for people to have a long perspective. But I think that in 50, 75 years, it's going to be 2 sentences in a paragraph. These times were tumultuous. It's nature.
Yes. Yeah, you have to be optimistic.
You have to. You have to. Otherwise, it's a sad existence. Mr. Dyson, thank you so very much for your time. And I'm looking forward to your next book. Hopefully not 80 years later.
No, I've done my books. I'm actually working on boats again.
Are you working on another kayak or a boat?
No, I have a little 50-year-old British motor sailor I'm restoring. It's the perfect Northwest Coast boat. I have friends, I won't name them, but who write a book every year. And I just can't do that. 5 books was enough. So
you go fishing with the boat?
You just go out living and visiting. I still have a place up in Canada that my mother had for 50 years.
Crabbing? Yeah,
more just fishing for food now and then, lingcod and stuff. Anyway, yeah, the world it's very, sort of an answer to your last statement. Yeah, if you go sit on a wild beach on the coast of British Columbia, you can't tell whether it's now or 300 years ago. Life is going along just fine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dyson, and hopefully see you on the water maybe.
Yes, thank you.